torture is written by an English Secretary of State. It's John Smith in the De Republica Anglorum. And Smith knew what he was talking about, because, of course, Smith was Secretary of State in this brief period when the English do use torture frequently, where again, it's circumstances very similar to now. It's the ideological warfare of Protestant versus Catholic in the second half of the 16th century. And suddenly, the rules against torture are broken and honoured more in the breach or the breaches or whatever than the observance. But nevertheless, Smith, as Secretary of State, again in charge of examination, had to be present. And he resigns rather than continues. It seems to me to be one of the, and you will find absolutely no equivalent anywhere else. In other words, the origins of our notion of cruel and unusual punishment, the notion of the treatment of those either under investigation or convicted, is almost entirely within the tradition of English law. There is no equivalent to the prison reform movement in Europe, the sort of Elizabeth Fry kind of thing. There's no equivalent. There are campaigns to make them more hygienic. There are campaigns to stop them breaking out and more disciplined and so on. But there is no equivalent of a humanitarian campaign. So again, I hope I'm coming up with some ideas that are really worth at least a moment's thought. And the final thought, because it's time that we ought to leave a little time for questions and discussions, as I've put some big ideas with deeply inadequate evidence, not even with a misremembered quote to support them. One of the other very striking things of English law, and I touched on this to begin with, is its jealousy, its sense of universality. Now, this may seem a rather less good thing. After all, the word jealous is often an ugly word for a very, very ugly thing. But right again, going back to Henry II, what is striking is the jealousy of English law, which is, of course, the basis of the most famous event of the reign of Henry II, the clash with Becket. Now, what essentially Henry was claiming was that everybody in England, of whatever status, was subject to the king's law, was subject to the criminal law. What Becket was claiming was special protected status for the church. And isn't it interesting how times, that wonderful phrase in Twelfth Night, where the jester sings, and the jester turns to Malvolio. I, my lord, was a brilliant Malvolio when I was a schoolboy, turns to Malvolio and says, "Thus the whirligig of time brings his revenges." Well, the whirligig of time has indeed brought its revenge with the child abuse scandal. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Becket is the patron saint of child abusers. The whole argument of the Roman Catholic Church for its special position, protected from the ordinary operations of law, is exactly what Becket was arguing. That is the struggle with Henry II. There's absolutely no doubt about it whatever. And it's fascinating that we've all got terribly sympathetic, and Becket, his martyr, poor old churchman, wicked king putting his neck upon him. Doesn't it all look different in the course of the last 18 months, 2 years? And this jealousy of English law is, in other words, it's a jealousy for any rival system of law within. If you have a system of law that depends upon consent, an imported law cannot carry that consent. This is the key issue. And you see it emerging again. Usually, of course, it emerges with the church, because what we must remember is, again, the church law is, of course, pure Roman law with an absolute universal sovereign. And so on. But it is also separately taught. It's the only law taught at Oxford and Cambridge. It colours the whole operations of the civil service of the most imperial-minded of the English kings, Edward I and so on. But it's undoubtedly seen as a fundamental rival system of law. It also covers much more than just what we might imagine, theology and so on. All forms of testamentary bequest which do not involve real property depend on church law. All forms of contract, most forms of contract, depend on church law because, of course, the contract is sealed by an oath and so on. But there's a profound and serious jealousy, and you can see it repeating itself at the end of the 14th century. There is, in the reign of Richard II, there are the Acts of Provisors and Praemunire, which are designed to stop papal legislation or the citation of papal legislation coming into England. And all of this, of course, receives its magnificent efflorescence in the reign of Henry VIII, with the complete rejection of papal authority, the authority of the universal church within England. And what is striking, ladies and gentlemen, about the reign of Henry VIII is that it is consciously presented. Its major forms of advocacy and propaganda are worked in terms